The sterile, fluorescent glow of the hospital waiting room did little to soothe the frayed nerves of those gathered. Among them was Mark, a young man whose impeccably tailored suit and slick-back hair spoke of ambition and a ruthless disregard for anything that didn't serve his upward climb. He was pacing, a coiled spring of impatience, checking his designer watch every few minutes. His grandmother, Eleanor Vance, lay in critical condition in the ICU after a sudden severe stroke. But for Mark, the emotional weight of the situation was overshadowed by a more pressing concern. Her will. Eleanor was a matriarch, a woman of formidable will and surprisingly vast, albeit understated wealth. Her fortune, built on shrewd decades-old investments and a quiet, almost reclusive lifestyle, was largely undocumented. Mark, her eldest grandson, had always seen himself as the rightful heir, the one destined to take over her empire, whatever it might be. He envisioned luxury cars, sprawling estates, and an unassailable position in the city's elite. He saw the other family members as obstacles. His Aunt Sarah, a gentle soul who ran a local animal shelter. His Uncle David, a quiet academic who preferred dusty books to power suits. And most frustratingly, his cousin Emily, a free-spirited artist who seemed to drift through life without a care in the world. They were all, in Mark's estimation, weak, sentimental, and utterly unqualified to manage Eleanor's legacy. He had already spent weeks, even months, subtly trying to influence Eleanor, dropping hints about his sound business mind and her relatives' impractical pursuits. He believed he had succeeded. He believed his grandmother, in her final moments of lucidity, had understood that he was the only one capable of preserving her wealth. He glanced at Emily, who sat hunched over a small sketch pad, her brow furrowed in concentration. She seemed lost in her own world, oblivious to the high-stakes drama unfolding around them. Mark scoffed inwardly. A true artist, he thought, completely useless in the real world. A nurse entered the waiting room, a quiet, kind-faced woman whose movements were methodical and calm. In her hand she held a large sealed legal envelope. She held it with a delicate reverence, as if it contained a secret of immense importance. Her voice, a soft whisper, broke the tense silence. "The family of Eleanor Vance?" she asked. Mark was on his feet in an instant, his pacing halted. "That's us," he said, his voice sharp and demanding. The nurse's gaze swept over the family members, a brief, silent assessment. "Eleanor, in a brief moment of lucidity this morning, entrusted me with this document," the nurse explained. "She asked that I give it to a family member with a specific instruction that it be opened by everyone together. Hospital policy dictates I must have a designated representative." Mark scoffed, his impatience boiling over. He strode toward the nurse, his face a mask of annoyance. "I'm the family representative," he stated, his voice cold and hard. "I'm her eldest grandson. Just give me the will." The nurse hesitated, her eyes flickering from Mark to the rest of the family. She saw the gentle faces of Sarah and David, their eyes filled with sorrow. She saw Emily, still bent over her sketchpad, her pen moving with a quiet grace. Mark's impatience turned to a vicious, cruel sneer. He glanced at Emily, then gestured toward her with a condescending scoff. "What? Are you waiting for her?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "She's just a child drawing pictures. She has no say in this." Emily looked up, her eyes wide and hurt. She had heard everything. Her hand froze over her drawing. The nurse was appalled, a flicker of outrage in her kind eyes. Without another word, Mark reached out and, with a swift, aggressive motion, snatched the envelope from her hand. It was a violent breach of trust, a symbolic kick to the heart of the family's grief. He held the will in his hands, but the victory was a hollow one. The cruelty of his actions had been revealed for all to see. Mark's face was a mask of cold triumph as he tore open the envelope. The sound of the tearing paper was a final, violent punctuation to the tense silence of the room. He unfolded the document, his eyes scanning the elegant, formal script with a self-important smirk. He had expected to see his name, his destiny, laid out in black and white. He cleared his throat, ready to make a grand announcement. But as he began to read, his triumphant expression faltered. The first few lines were a standard legal preamble, but the words that followed were anything but. The will did not name a sole heir. Instead, it spoke of a journey. Eleanor, in her final act, had designed a scavenger hunt. The document stated that her final testament and the bulk of her estate were not in a bank vault or a safety deposit box, but were hidden. To find it, the family had to complete a series of tasks, a journey of discovery that would test their character, their cooperation, and their ability to see the world as she did. Mark's face went pale. He scoffed, his voice filled with annoyance. What is this? A joke? She can't be serious. He read the next line aloud, a cold, hollow sound in the silent room. The first clue, his grandmother Rinwill declared, is hidden with the one who demonstrated true dignity in the face of unseemly aggression and cold contempt in my final hours. Mark's eyes darted to Emily, who sat frozen with shock. The triumphant smile on his face vanished completely. The public outburst, the verbal attack on Emily, the violent snatching of the will, all of it had been the first test. He had already failed. He looked up, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. The silence was thick, but it was quickly shattered by Markian's furious roar. He crumpled the will in his hand and pointed a trembling finger at Emily. "This is your fault," he screamed, his face contorted with rage. "Give it to me, Emily. Whatever that pathetic clue is, give it to me now." He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched. But Emily didn't flinch. Her hand, which had been drawing with a quiet grace just moments ago, held the sketch pad with a new, unyielding firmness. She met his gaze. Her eyes, once filled with silent hurt, now held a quiet, surprising resolve. She was no longer a victim. She was the gatekeeper. "No, Mark," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Grandma said it's a family journey. We all have to do this together." Mark's mouth fell open, a silent gasp of disbelief. His words, which had always held the weight of authority, were now powerless against her simple resolve. Just then, a warm, reassuring hand was placed on Emily's shoulder. It was Sarah, her gentle eyes fixed on Mark. David, the quiet academic, stepped forward as well, his posture rigid with a quiet purpose. They were a silent wall, a unified front against Mark's aggression. "This is a joke," Mark fumed, his voice cracking with a mixture of fury and desperation. "You think I'm going to play some ridiculous game with you people? I'm the one with the business sense. I'm the one who should have her money." David, for the first time, looked directly at Mark, his eyes holding a profound disappointment. "Grandma knew that." "Mark," he said, his voice low, "that's why this isn't about business. It's about family. And you just failed the first test." The tension in the room was a tangible thing. Mark was alone, a shark who had just been surrounded by a pod of dolphins, and his rage was turning into a terrified powerlessness. Mark stood motionless, his rage a tangible, suffocating force in the room. He was about to storm out, to call his high-powered lawyers, to have this ridiculous, insulting will thrown out. But David, his voice quiet but firm, cut him off. "Grandma thought of that, Mark. Her will states that if any family member attempts to legally contest the will, the entire estate is automatically donated to charity. Everything. It's a lose-lose for all of us." The color drained from Mark's face. He was trapped. His grandmother had outplayed him from beyond the grave. Emily, with a sad but determined look, approached him. "We aren't going to fight you, Mark," she said, her voice soft, "but we are going to follow Grandma's wishes. The clock is ticking." She turned her sketch pad over. On the back, in a small, intricate drawing, was the first clue. It was a sketch of an old cracked teacup with a small, unblinking eye painted on its surface. Mark scoffed. "A teacup? This is what you're basing a multi-million-dollar hunt on. It's pathetic." But the others looked at the drawing with a sense of wonder. Emily explained that their grandmother had always carried the cup with her. She had called it her lucky charm. Mark had always dismissed it as useless junk. The will had stated that the next clue would be with the object that represented a silent witness to her long life. The family looked at each other, their faces filled with a new sense of purpose. They knew exactly where to find the teacup. They had a destination, a new quest, and a common goal. They walked toward the door, leaving Mark standing alone in the waiting room, a monument to his own greed. He was faced with a choice: lose everything he had ever wanted, or submit to a game he despised, a game where he was not the leader, and where the first test had already proven his worthlessness. Mark stood motionless in the sterile silence of the waiting room, the crumpled will clutched in his hand. He watched as his family, a unified front of quiet determination, disappeared through the hospital doors. A wave of suffocating rage washed over him, followed by a cold, numbing fear. His careful, feconsted plan, his entire future, was crumbling before his eyes. His first instinct was to fight, to call his high-powered lawyers and contest the will. But the memory of David's words, the part about the estate being donated to charity, was an icy shackle around his wrist. His grandmother had thought of everything. She had built a trap, and he was squarely in the middle of it. He was alone, but he was not out of the game. Not yet. The rage turned into a cold, calculated resolve. He could to fight them in court, but he could still win. He just had to play by their rules. For now he scoffed at the ridiculousness of it all. A scavenger hunt for millions. It was childish beneath him. But it was the only path forward, he told himself. He was only doing it for the money. He told himself he would let them do the heavy lifting, the sentimental, emotional part of the journey, and he would swoop in at the end and take what was rightfully his. The teacup, he decided, was just a distraction, a useless piece of junk that had no value, just like the people who were so obsessed with it. He smoothed out his wrinkled suit jacket, a small attempt to reclaim his old composure, and walked out of the hospital. He spotted his family car pulling out of the parking lot and hailed a cab, instructing the driver to follow them at a safe distance. He was in the game, but he was not playing with them. He was playing against them, and he was determined to win no matter what it took. The first test was over, and he had failed, but he was sure he would pass the next one. The cab followed the family's car for 30 minutes, taking Mark on a journey through parts of the city he never bothered to drive through himself. They pulled into a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, filled with modest two-story houses. The family's car stopped in front of a small, well-kept home with a tidy lawn and a single porch light. This was Eleanor's home. Mark scoffed inwardly. He had always imagined his grandmother's fortune was hidden in a sprawling mansion or a luxury condo, not in this pathetic little house. He had always found excuses not to visit, calling her out of the way, but in reality he found her quaint lifestyle to be a little embarrassing. He had no respect for a woman who had a secret fortune but lived like a pauper. He paid the cab driver and stood across the street, a predator watching his prey from the shadows. He watched as his Aunt Sarah, his Uncle David, and his cousin Emily walked up the path together. They weren't in a hurry. They entered the house with a quiet, shared purpose. Mark's impatience flared. He knew the teacup was in there, a single clue to a fortune, but he couldn't just storm in. He was an outsider now, a spy in his own family. He felt a surge of cold fury. This was ridiculous. He had a million things he could be doing, and here he was, standing on a residential street in a suit that cost more than a month's rent. The minutes ticked by, each one a torment of waiting. He watched the light turn on in the living room window, and he knew he couldn't wait forever. He had to go in with a defeated sigh, a sigh of pure submission. He crossed the street and walked up the front path. Mark entered the house, the door clicking softly shut behind him, a final hollow sound in the silent room. The air was thick with the scent of his grandmother Rin Life, old books, tea, and a floral perfume he vaguely remembered from childhood. The family was gathered in the living room, their faces turning toward him, not with the anger he expected, but with a cool, detached indifference that was far more cutting than a shouted insult. He was no longer a person to them. He was a spectator, an unwelcome ghost in his own family's home. Sarah was holding the teacup from Emily in drawing. It was old and delicate, a porcelain cup with a floral design and a small unblinking eye painted on its surface. Mark, trying to regain some semblance of control, strode forward. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice a little too loud in the quiet room. "What's the clue? What does it say, David?" His academic uncle looked at him with a calm, sad knowing. "It's not what it says, Mark. It's what it is." He gestured to the teacup. "Grandma said the next clue would be with the cup, but she didn't say it was on it." The family looked at the teacup with a quiet reverence that Mark couldn't understand. He just saw an old, worthless piece of porcelain. Emily, with a gentle grace that belied her quiet nature, took the teacup from Sarah. "Grandma always said this cup helped her see the world differently," Emily said. She placed her palm on the side of the cup, and with a small, almost imperceptible twist, a tiny concealed drawer popped open from the bottom of the cup's base. Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. He had dismissed the cup, and in doing so he had missed the most obvious secret. Inside the tiny drawer, on a small folded piece of paper, was the next clue. Emily carefully took the tiny piece of paper from the secret compartment and unfolded it. It was a single line of elegant handwritten text, a riddle that seemed to mock Marquis' cold, logical mind. It said, "The next secret lies where the flowers of my first love grew, beneath a stone of silent words and a promise that was never broken." Mark's face scrunched up in confusion. "What is that?" he demanded, reaching for the paper. "It's meaningless. There's no address, no coordinates. This is a joke." But Emily pulled the paper away, and his old arrogance was powerless against her newfound purpose. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, a soft, sad smile on her face. "Oh, Grandma," she whispered. "I know this place. It's the old community garden on the corner of Elm Street and 12th. It's where she and Grandpa first met. He gave her a single red rose there." David nodded, his face etched with a quiet understanding and a promise of silent words. "It's the stone plaque they laid after he died, the one with no name, just a quote from his favorite poet. The promise was to stay with him forever." Mark was stunned. He had never heard these stories. He had always dismissed this part of his grandmother's life, the sentimental quiet moments, as pathetic and useless. He had no memory of the garden, the rose, or the stone plaque. The family began to move toward the door, their faces filled with a new sense of shared purpose, a purpose he couldn't be a part of. The map they were following wasn't on a piece of paper. It was in their hearts, a map he couldn't read. He stood alone in the middle of the living room, a man who had all the facts but none of the understanding. He was an outsider in his own family, and this time he was truly kicked out of the game. Mark stood motionless in the empty living room, the weight of his failure a crushing burden. He was a man who had always been in control, and now he was a pawn in a game he didn't understand. His mind, which had always run on logic and data, was useless here. There was no financial report, no legal precedent, no market analysis that could tell him what a stone of silent words meant. He was lost. His fury, which had been a fire in his veins, turned into a cold, calculated desperation. He ran out of the house, got into his car, and with a grim resolve followed his family's taillights through the city streets. He was a predator who had just realized his prey was the one who had the map. He followed their car through the quiet streets, a silent, tense observer. They were a unified force, a team bound by memory and love, and he was an outsider, a spy in his own family's quest. The city lights blurred in the reflection of his windshield, and his mind was a single frantic thought. Just get there. Just don't lose them. They pulled up to the old community garden. It was a place of quiet, simple beauty, and Mark felt a familiar scoff rise in his throat. What a pathetic place for a secret. He parked at a distance, hidden behind a large oak tree, and watched. He saw them get out of the car, their faces illuminated by the moonlight. They were not looking for a clue, they were looking for a memory. He saw Sarah, with tears in her eyes, point to a single bed of wilted roses. He saw David, with a gentle smile, touch the small stone plaque beside it. He saw Emily place her hand on the dirt, as if connecting with her. He was a ghost in a place filled with life and memory. He had all the facts, but none of the feelings. And for the first time he felt the true weight of what he had lost. Mark watched from the shadow of the oak tree as his family approached the stone plaque. He saw the way David Bean's face softened as he read the quote aloud, a low, reverent sound that Mark couldn't quite hear. He scoffed inwardly. He had no time for this sentimental nonsense. He was looking for a secret compartment, a hidden latch, something that a computer or a lawyer could find. But the secret, he quickly realized, was not in the stone. It was in the story. The plaque was a sundial, and David, with a sad but knowing smile, pointed to a small worn stone at the base of a young tree a few feet away. Grandma always said, "Time is not measured by the clock, but by the love you have in your heart," David said softly, his voice a low rumble. "The time on the sundial," he explained, "points to the exact spot where Grandpa planted this tree on the day they first met." It was a puzzle that could only be solved with love, not with logic. The family moved to the spot, and together, with a quiet reverence, they lifted the small worn stone. Underneath, nestled in a small, hollowed-out space, was a single, beautifully carved wooden bird, a sparrow. It was a detail so personal, so small, that Mark would have dismissed it in a second. The bird held a small, delicate key in its beak, and on its belly was another inscription. A single word. They stared at it for a long moment, a shared moment of triumph and understanding. Mark, from his hiding place, saw them huddled together, their faces filled with a quiet awe. He was on the outside, a prisoner of his own arrogance, and he felt a cold, sharp pang of utter powerlessness. The family huddled together, their faces lit by the glow of the streetlights. Emily carefully turned the wooden sparrow over, and they saw a single word carved on its belly. Evergreen. Mark, watching from his hiding place, scowled. He had no idea what the word meant. It was just another piece of a useless, sentimental puzzle. But for his family, the word was a key. Their grandmother had a small private bank account in a local, unassuming financial institution called Evergreen Bank. Mark had always scoffed at her for not using his prestigious, high-end bank, a symbol of his arrogance and her quiet humility. She had always told him that her money was safe where her heart was. The family got into the car, their faces filled with a new sense of purpose, and drove off. Mark in his own car followed them. He was a silent spectator, watching his family solve a puzzle with a language he couldn't speak, a language of memory and love. They were on a journey of discovery, and he was on a chase for a fortune. They pulled up to a small, unassuming bank branch, a building that was a world away from the gleaming marble towers of his own financial world. The building was old, and its modest architecture was a testament to his grandmother's simple, unassuming nature, something he had never understood. They had the key, the small one from the bird, and they had the password Evergreen. Mark's heart pounded with a frantic rhythm. He was about to find out if his arrogance had cost him a fortune. He parked his car at a safe distance and watched as they approached the bank door. The suspense was almost unbearable. He had to know what was inside. The family walked into the small bank, its modest lobby a stark contrast to the sprawling modern financial institutions of the city. A bank manager, an older man with a kind face, recognized them immediately. He had known their grandmother for years. They showed him the key and said the word, Evergreen. The manager looked at the key, a small smile forming on his face. "Ah," he said softly. "Eleanor and final key. I've been waiting for this." He led them not to a massive vault, but to a small private office in the back. He opened a simple, unassuming drawer and pulled out a small, worn-out wooden box. He placed the box on the desk, his eyes filled with a deep respect. "This is where your grandmother kept all of her most important documents," he explained. "She was a major investor in this bank for years. A quiet, unseen force that kept us afloat during the last recession. Most people thought her wealth was in a grand vault, but she kept it here in a series of quiet, humble investments." He looked at them, and with a kind, sad smile, he revealed the truth. "Your grandmother used her money not to amass a fortune, but to help people in this community. She was our silent benefactor, a quiet force for good." He handed them a simple, single sheet of paper from the box, her final will. It revealed the true extent of her wealth and a list of her charitable foundations, a legacy of kindness that was a stark contrast to Mark's world. The manager's words hung in the air, a final testament to the woman they thought they knew. Mark, having watched the entire scene from outside, could no longer stand it. He burst into the bank, his face a mask of furious impatience. He looked around, his eyes wild, expecting to see a grand vault, a room filled with gold and jewels. But he saw only a small office, a small worn-out wooden box, and his family looking at him with a quiet, calm pity. "Where is it?" he demanded, his voice a frantic, desperate shout that echoed in the quiet room. "Where's the money? Where's the vault?" The bank manager looked at him, his face filled with a deep sense of sadness. "It's all right here, son," he said, gesturing to the small box on the table. Mark scoffed. "This is a joke. It's a joke," he screamed, his voice thick with a defeated rage. He reached for the will, and Emily, with a quiet strength, handed it to him. He scanned the document, his eyes racing over the words, and his face went pale. The will stated that the inheritance was not a personal fortune, but a charitable trust, a legacy of kindness that was to be managed by the one who showed the most compassion, and that person was Emily. Mark looked up, his eyes filled with a terrified disbelief. Emily, the girl he had laughed at, the useless artist, was now his new boss, the caretaker of the fortune he so desperately wanted. His greed had led him to his ultimate defeat. His cruel transactional nature, the very thing that made him think he was superior, had cost him everything. He had been kicked out of his family, his inheritance, and his future. He stood there, a shattered man, in the middle of a room filled with quiet, dignified triumph. His downfall was a final, profound testament to the truth that some things are priceless, and some lessons are learned the hard way. The silence that followed was more deafening than any scream. Mark stood there, the will clutched in his hand, a ghost in a room filled with quiet triumph. He had lost, not to a better opponent, but to a different set of values. The very thing he had always mocked, kindness, compassion, and sentimentality, had proven to be the most powerful currency of all. He walked out of the bank, a shattered man, and the city, once a playground for his ambition, was now a cold, unforgiving labyrinth. His high-end job, his high-powered associates, his meticulously crafted life, all of it unraveled in a matter of weeks. He was alone, a testament to the truth that some losses are not financial but moral. The scene shifts to a few months later. Emily and her family, now the caretakers of a vast charitable trust, had found their purpose. They were using their grandmother's fortune not to build towers of steel and glass, but to build a better community. They built shelters for the homeless, and opened animal rescue centers, and funded art programs for underprivileged children. Their lives, once filled with grief, were now filled with a quiet, profound joy. Their victory was a quiet one, a testament to a legacy that was about giving, not about taking. The final scene is a simple one. Emily is at the same grocery store where the story began. A young man in front of her is flustered and embarrassed when his card is declined. Emily, without a second thought, steps forward and pays for his groceries. As she hands him the receipt, she gives him a small, simple card. It is unmarked, but on the back is a single, elegant line of script. It says, "Kindness has a way of coming back." It is not a promise of money or a grand inheritance, but a payment of a different kind. The story was not about a will, a fortune, or a revenge plot. It was about a single act of kindness, a single payment, that changed a family's soul and proved that the greatest wealth of all is found not in what you possess, but in the compassion you show to a stranger.